Thank you. Chairman of the Lee Kuan Yew School Board, Professor Wang Gangwu, IPS Special Advisor, Professor Tommy Koh, Your Excellencies, CEOs, ambassadors, distinguished civil servants, and all the rest of you poor people, welcome to Singapore Perspectives. Welcome to Singapore Perspectives 2014. Exactly 195 years ago today, Stamford Raffles first stepped foot in Singapore on January 28, 1819. In the last 2 centuries since, we've had quite a few disturbances, most recently the riot in Little India. But if I were to ask you, which was the worst riot in modern Singapore's history, what would be your answer? The 1964 Chinese-Malay riot? No, not quite. How about the Hockley bus strike of 1855 or the Maria Hertog riot of 1950? Not quite again. 18 people were killed in the Maria Hertog riot, 4 in the Hockley bus strike, and 36 people in 1964. The worst riot in Singapore's history occurred just 35 years after the founding of modern Singapore in 1854, 160 years ago this year. More than 400 people were killed in that riot, which lasted for 10 to 12 days. And who were the combatants in that riot? Malays and Chinese? No. Indians and Chinese? No. Foreign guest workers who had too much to drink? Definitely not. Apart from a few thousand Malays, everyone here then was by definition a foreign worker. The combatants were Teochews and Hokkiens. There was a time when they didn't like each other. According to Charles Burton Buckley's invaluable and anecdotal history of old times in Singapore, a book which I would recommend, the background to the conflict was the refusal of the Hokkiens to join in a subscription to assist the rebels who had been driven from Amoy by the Imperial China troops. The match that lit the conflagration, astonishingly enough, was a dispute between a Hokkien trader and a Teochew about the weight of a catty of rice, which the one was selling the other. One fellow tried to cheat another, and 10 to 12 days later, more than 400 people were dead. I recall this history both for its intrinsic interest. There was indeed a time in Singapore when Teochews and Hokkiens considered themselves different countrymen, as well as to illustrate how very mobile differences the title of this conference is. There are always differences. We are human, therefore we are different. We are human, therefore we judge and make distinctions among people, we categorize, divide, and slot. But the differences that we choose to emphasize at any one time are never stable. Differences differ over time and space. You take color, for instance. For centuries in Europe and the Mediterranean world, from the Hellenic period to the late Middle Ages, there was hardly any color prejudice. And then you got a whole slew of figural associations drawing sharp distinctions between white and black, fair and dark. White meant saved, black meant damned, and so on. Today, color prejudice is regarded as stupid, and few, if any, among the educated in this audience, for instance, would openly admit to having color prejudices. Or take the question of slavery. For centuries, for thousands of years, taken for granted in almost every civilization known to us. Pericles and Plato, Cicero and Caesar, all very different individuals with very different worldviews, but they all accepted as a matter of course that the Hellenic and Roman civilizations could not be sustained without a very large slave population. The slave trade was not abolished in Britain till 1807, and slavery itself was not abolished in the British Empire till 1833. It ended in the United States, as all of you know, only in 1865 after a bloody civil war. Today, we find not only slavery abhorrent, we are also uncomfortable with sharp disparities of income and wealth. When we look at the differences that have racked humanity, slavery and color prejudice, racial and racial prejudices, pogroms and Holocausts which Jews suffered, the genocides of native populations in the Americas, the horrifying religious wars of Europe, the partition of the Indian subcontinent, the deprivation of Palestinians of their homeland, to mention just a few examples, when you consider these examples of difference, including from our own history, we understand what moved James Joyce, the great Irish writer, to declare, "History is a nightmare from which I am trying to awake." The operative phrase here is trying to awake, for the persistence of differences implies we will forever be awaking. Even in Singapore, where we've always been plagued with questions of identity and difference. Who are we? Who might we become? Who is not us? I myself was born a British subject, became a Malaysian briefly, and then a Singaporean at the age of 10. My father was born a British subject, was subjected to Japanese rule for 3 years, became a Malaysian for 6 years, and then became a Singaporean at the age of 46. He obtained his identity card, like many in his generation, very late in life. I remember singing God Save the Queen in kindergarten, then Majula Singapura in primary 1 when Singapore became self-governing, then Negara Crew from primary 3 to 5 when we were part of Malaysia, and then back to Majula Singapura in primary 6. Perhaps inevitably, given these memories, I have a greater sense of the incompleteness of identity, of having to exist among incommensurable pluralities than someone born after 1965. Indeed, I'm surprised, as many in my generation I think would be, at the speed, the thoroughness even with which we have overcome primordial differences of race, religion, and language. History in this regard is a nightmare from which we have substantially, not wholly or in full measure, but very substantially awoken. Take a look at the finding, this particular finding in the IPS survey on Singaporeans' attitudes on race, language, and religion, which Dr. Matthew Matthews will share with you in a little while. More than 85% of the 4,000 odd respondents we interviewed said they didn't think they were treated differently on account of their race in hospitals, schools, at public counters, in courts, or by the police. This figure did not differ when we looked at the responses of minorities compared to the Chinese. The public sphere in Singapore, what we sometimes refer to as the common space, is remarkably free of racial or religious prejudice. We are one people regardless of race, language, or religion. Think about how extraordinary this is. Just take the police, an object of suspicion among minorities in many countries, including in the United States and Britain. Los Angeles erupted in riots in 1992 after LAPD officers were caught on video beating up a black man, Rodney King. We got the Rodney King riots. In Singapore, more than 85% of our minorities believe as a matter of course that the police would treat them the same way as they would treat the majority. This is something we can take immense pride in. But remember, it didn't happen by accident. We can't take this for granted. For we are not always one people, regardless of race, language, or religion, in the private sphere, as the next slide indicates. The first column shows the non-Chinese who would be comfortable with a local-born Chinese for a spouse, as a spouse, brother, or sister-in-law, close friend. Second column, the non-Malays who would be comfortable with a local-born Malay for a spouse, brother, or sister-in-law, and so on. As you can see, all things are not equal. I don't quite understand this slide because, as you can see, a higher percentage wouldn't mind an in-law for an Indian, but higher percentage wouldn't mind an in-law for an Indian than a spouse for an Indian. I don't understand how you get a mother-in-law, Indian mother-in-law without marrying an Indian, but as the case may be. And as you can see, the proportions drop further for new Singaporeans from China or India, even for friends. Which brings me to my next point. As a result of immigration, especially among Chinese and Indians, The divisions within each race are now greater than the differences between the races. Local-born Chinese feel more in common with local-born Malays and Indians than they do with ethnic Chinese from elsewhere. They, even if they are ethnically similar, are not us. A point underlined in this slide, which shows comfort levels. This is a bit mixed up, yeah. Comfort levels with new Singaporeans from China and India as your boss, your neighbor, your employee, lower than comfort levels with local-born Chinese of whatever race. I won't speak much of this now, but I would be remiss if I didn't sound a warning. The levels of hatred that incidents like the Anton Casey affair have unearthed are frightful. Whatever the instigation, and his remarks were indeed oafish, we should not countenance such violent expressions, including of death threats. Hatred of the foreigner, xenophobia, are even now reshaping the politics of many developed countries, including in Europe, including in Scandinavia, where we are seeing the growth of extreme right, sometimes neo-fascist parties. Do not assume this cannot happen here. Singapore, as I alluded to just now, was for long mostly filled with foreigners. This was how our population grew as a result, mostly of immigration from 1819. And as you can see from this slide, based on the findings of IPS research fellow Yap Mui Theng, till World War II made immigration difficult and the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949 closed off contacts between China and the outside world, the majority of people here at any one time for most of our history were actually born elsewhere. They were foreign born. The figures for 2010 here includes non-resident foreigners, work permit holders, domestic maids, employment pass holders, etc. We have to do a better job integrating them into society while maintaining our core identity as Singaporeans. Finally, a word about income inequality and slowing social mobility. In my view, perhaps our most serious challenge today and likely to get worse. This slide shows household income distribution in the US. The rest of the developed world is not as bad, but we are getting there, including in Singapore. From the 5th to the 90th percentile, you have a gentle slope upwards. From the 90th to the 95th percentile, the line goes up increasingly at a sharp 45-degree angle. And then from the 95th to the 100th, a straight line shooting up. That means the percentage difference of income between the 99th and, say, the 95th percentile can be greater than the difference between the 90th and the 50th percentile. Indeed, the situation is so bad that it's income inequality within the top 1% in the US, and in Singapore too. You would earn above $300,000 US in America, you are among the top 1%. But the average income of the top 1% in the United States is more than $700,000. And the average income of the top 1% of the top 1%, which means 0.001, is 27 million. Average income. At the very, very top, there are always a couple of people each year who earn in excess of 1 billion. The wealth gap is worse than the income gap. Altogether, the top 1% controls 43% of America's wealth. The next 4% controls an additional 29%. So you have the top 5% of the country sitting on 72% of the country's wealth, almost 3/4. Leslie Teo will touch further on this issue later. One reason why we are facing this problem in developed economies is what Professor Freeman of Harvard calls the great doubling of the global workforce. This appeared recently in the Atlantic Monthly. It's a very interesting graph which shows the percentile of global income distribution, in other words, the entire world from the poorest to the richest in the world. And as you can see, people in China, India, who entered the global workforce, the global market in the 1980s, beginning in the 1980s, saw their incomes rise by a huge percentage. We are somewhere towards here in the middle decline of the developed world middle class. We are seeing our income increase at a much slower rate as a result of the entry of China, India, and the former Soviet bloc into the global economy. Finally, you might wonder, why did we choose this theme of differences? The truth is, our society has changed, is changing. Singapore has become more diverse, and in ways that we are not as yet familiar or comfortable. To talk about differences is to talk about ourselves. It is the most important conversation that we can have among ourselves. For how else can we understand each other, appreciate each other, learn what binds us? E pluribus unum, as the Americans would say, from many one. One precisely because we are many. One yet many, many yet one. That is the ideal. I thank IPS Research Fellows Matthew Matthews, Christopher Gee, and Wai Fong for organizing this conference. I also thank Irene Lim and the IPS staff for setting all this up. They've been here toiling away since last evening at 6 p.m. And I thank our most generous sponsors, Keppel, Temasek, and the others listed on this backdrop for giving us so generously. Becoming a Singaporean, being a Singaporean is not easy. It is hard work. As Rajaratnam famously put it, being a Singaporean is not a matter of ancestry. It is a matter of conviction and choice. You've got to want this bad. It is a matter, you've got to believe that there is something more than what we each bring to the table. Our racial identities, our cultures, our nationalities, our differences. And you've got to believe that more, which encompasses our separate identities, is not a matter of subtraction, but addition. Enlargement, not contraction, more, not less. We became independent because we believed that was possible. We chose this more difficult, more noble path. If we had been satisfied with less, there need not have been separation. We wanted a more perfect society, a fairer and just nation. We've come this far. I think we can go further. Thank you very much.